Hey guys, Styles Hanley here, bringing you a bunch of secrets, fun facts, and things you missed in the new Christmas update for Gorilla Tag. Subscribe if you learned something new. So if you didn't know about the ornaments that you can pick up and place on the hooks and you can put on the tree and make it light up, you do now. But there are a bunch of hooks around the map. In total, there are 146 of these hooks around forest and cloud. This present in caves that you can jump in and go tiny is actually old cut content from last year's Christmas update. Down into mines and you come into this little dead end over here and you'll see this. You won't be able to see this because it was removed, but you can get in here and you can have like a little mini map inside of another map. I'm glad it finally got used. Hopefully people don't just hide in there. And you've probably noticed it, but the ornaments aren't the only holdable, throwable things that we have. You also have these little candy buckets. You can pick out some candy and throw it. I think each map has at least one of them. These big boards in beach and mountains are Hanukkah candle holders. So there's nothing in it now, but during the 9 days of Hanukkah, I'm guessing we'll just have a candle that gets added each day. Being more inclusive in the holidays than just Christmas. There is a secret present way out of bounds in caves, just sitting over here in the void. I found Gorilla Tag's secret present, oh my god. And if you didn't know, dreidels are an actual game with some kind of scoring. I'm not sure how it is, but I'll try to explain it from looking it up. Alright, this is none, which means nothing happens. This is Ganel, so you get everything. This one back here means hey, which means you get half of the stuff in the pot. And this one means shin or pet, which means that you have to just like add another piece to the pot. So now you know how to play the dreidel game, and you can bet with it. And the little elf monkeys are back. Here's the location of every single one. Starting with this one down here in city. These three, one in each of the stockings up here in city. As well as the three that are worshiping the OG turkey leg in there. Mountains has 4 all on top of the slide. 1 here, and 2 here. Forest only has these 3 sitting at the snowman. The entrance to canyons has 2, 1 here giving a bow to the snowman, and the other one hanging off the hat of this one. And the ones in canyons itself are right here. There's 3 of them trying to hang on to an ornament under this pillow. This light just reminds me of Blue Pillow. Subscribe if you miss Blue Pillow. Basement has 5. 1 at the computer, 1 at this little mouse hole, 1 at the lava lamp right here, 1 holding the couch cushion up, and 1 holding the books up at the bookcase. And caves has 4. 2 of them here praying for the return of mines, and 2 up here trying to hide. And as well as that, if you haven't noticed, Doug and Beef the Bat both have little Santa hats on. That's nice. If you grab the train, you become tiny. Wow. And then you can grab onto the train. The camera looks weird, but you can grab onto the actual train and just hold on to it. Oh, goodbye. But that's gonna be the end of this video. Subscribe if you learned something new. Make sure you join the Discord, and I hope you guys enjoyed.